In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Gospel of Mark. We're going to talk about some background information, such as who Mark was, when he wrote this, who he was writing to, and then we'll also look at some things such as the structure of his Gospel and some of the themes that are a big deal in his Gospel. So, looking first at this background information, it is widely attested that Mark, or John Mark, is the author of this gospel. But interestingly, Peter, the apostle, was who he went to get his source material. So, remember when we talked about the Gospel of Matthew, that all four of the Gospel authors had this eyewitness relationship to Jesus and his ministry. And so, with the Gospel of Mark, in this case, Mark maybe wasn't an eyewitness for everything, but he's relying on Peter and Peter's testimony. So Peter was one of the 12 apostles, and he was actually in the inner circle of Jesus's disciples. He was one of the three that were very close-knit with Jesus. So early church fathers have attested to John Mark writing about Peter's experiences from the very beginning. So if you look at some of these early church father writings, they point to the fact that Mark is using the experiences of Peter in his writing. As far as what we know about Mark himself, we know that he was a Jewish Christian, so he was not a Gentile. He was a Jew that converted to Christianity, and he was a big part of the early church. He was involved in the early church, and he actually went on missionary journeys with Paul, and you can find all of that account in Acts. So that's a little bit about both John Mark and Peter, who he was using for his testimony. Now, as far as the date that Mark wrote this gospel, most authors believe that it was written sometime in the early 60s, and scholars also believe that it was the first gospel to be written. So even though it comes second in the New Testament, scholars believe that it was written before Matthew. So basically, most people think that Mark was written or Mark wrote his gospel, and it began to circulate amongst the people, and then Matthew and Luke actually have Mark's gospel and use it as kind of a jumping off point for their own gospels. So there's that, and then Mark is actually doing something interesting here in writing his gospel in the first place. This was very much still an oral culture, and so things were usually passed down orally, so stories were told, and things were passed down throughout the generations from just word of mouth. But Mark here does something new in that he decides to record all of these stories and the life and teachings of Jesus on paper. So this was a big thing that Mark did, that though he was part of an oral tradition, he thought that this was important enough to write down and preserve. So Mark seems to be writing to Gentile Christians. So remember, these are people that converted to Christianity that were not Jewish. So he was writing to Gentile Christians specifically in Rome. You may not know a lot about Rome in the New Testament times, but it was quite a place to be. The Christians at this time were very, very disliked by the Emperor Nero. Nero kind of had a vendetta against the Christians, and they suffered immensely during his reign. And so it is believed that Mark is writing to these Christians in Rome who are feeling this persecution from Nero. And it seems that they are Christians who are Greek speakers, which was the language in Rome, rather than Hebrew or Aramaic. So as far as Mark's reason for writing, just jumping off of the fact that these are Christians in Rome, Mark is writing to encourage them basically to just keep going and hold on to the faith as they endure this horrible persecution under Nero. And so he is hoping to remind them to hold on to the faith and to hold on to the fact that Jesus truly is the Messiah. He is the King, and through him all things will be made right. And so basically Mark is reminding them that this person of Jesus that they had heard about, he is truly the Messiah, and because of him everything is different, and they will not suffer in vain. Now, looking at the structure, there's quite a bit that sets Mark apart, or that is unique about Mark. It is actually the shortest gospel, so it's only 16 chapters. And one thing you'll notice as you read this gospel is that it just moves at a really fast pace. It's super action packed. So, going back to this whole idea of an oral tradition, it seems like Mark's gospel was likely meant to be performed or read aloud. So you can see as you read it that it would be great for reading aloud if you were, reading a story to a group of people. You'll notice things like the word immediately. This was like Mark's favorite word to use, like to transition. Like he talks about immediately this happened and then immediately that happened. And so he's always moving from one thing to the next. And then you may also notice that he uses basically all present tense verbs. So this was just a way to, keep it fast paced and to keep it moving. So be on the lookout for that. Next, Mark records more miracles of Jesus than any of the other Gospels. So he is really highlighting all these things that Jesus did, all these miraculous ways that Jesus acted. And interestingly, he really seems to emphasize the reaction of the crowds and the people that witnessed Jesus's miracles. And usually he records that the people are shocked and amazed by what Jesus had done. And you'll notice as you read the gospel that this shock and amazement doesn't necessarily mean that they became devoted followers of Jesus, but it does point to just that Jesus was doing something new, and the people were totally caught and surprised by what Jesus was doing. Another interesting thing about Mark is his gospel does not contain the birth narrative of Jesus. So you'll notice, like back when you read Matthew, that his gospel includes the birth of Jesus, and then Luke does as well. But here in Mark just jumps right in. He goes straight into Jesus's ministry. This can be kind of helpful to think about the structure of the book when you think about three major passages that kind of divide up the book. So, skipping to the middle here, this Mark chapter 8, verses 29, you can see this as basically the turning point or the climax of the whole book. And in this verse, Peter, one of the disciples, the one that is giving information and his testimony to John Mark, it is here in this chapter that Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ or the Messiah in Caesarea Philippi. So you have this build-up throughout the whole book, and then you come to this huge moment where Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ. Now, bookended with that is first Mark's personal testimony in chapter 1, verse 1, where he says that this is the good news about Jesus the Messiah. So he's writing and saying that this person, this Jesus of Nazareth, is the Messiah. And then at the end of the book, you have the confession of a Roman centurion, which is a big deal because, Jesus was crucified by the Roman officials for being this messianic pretender, this person that was trying to politically overthrow the Roman government and was impersonating to be the king of the Jews. And yet, it is at his death and resurrection that this Roman centurion, this Roman guard, realizes and exclaims, "Surely this man was the Son of God." And so you have this third important moment at the end of the book where you can see that Mark is including this to say, hey, look, people are starting to notice that this Jesus actually is the Messiah. He actually is who he was saying he was. So then looking a little bit more in how you can kind of think of this gospel in a few different parts, you can see it basically as two different parts with that climax verse, Mark 8, I think verse 29, being the very middle of the book. So basically, up until that point, Jesus is working in the public eye. He is doing things out in public in the area of Galilee. And so he's doing miracles, he's teaching, he's becoming known, and he's gaining popularity. But then you'll notice as beginning in chapter 8 that once once the disciples have recognized him as the Christ or the Messiah, there's kind of this change in tone where Jesus begins to explain to the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and he must die. And so then things become a little bit more private, where he is explaining these things to the disciples, to his closer group. And then next, another thing that you should notice or that you may not know, is that most scholars agree that Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, weren't actually in the original manuscripts. So these verses seem to be added later. And when you read this gospel, you'll notice this is a really crazy point in which Mark would end. So take a look at Mark chapter 16, verse 8. And you'll notice this is not a typical place that you would think that Mark would end his gospel. And so scholars have a few ideas on why Mark would have ended here or what could have happened. I think that the best possibility is that at this time manuscripts were kind of all rolled up together. So it wasn't like a book that we have today, but it would be multiple pieces of paper that are all rolled up together. And so it could be the case that the last piece of the manuscript, the last piece of paper, could have been lost. And so that's not agreed on by all scholars. But that is a pretty good potential reason that Mark 16 ends abruptly at verse 8. But then if you'll look in the translation that you read, most Bible translations do go ahead and include those last verses 9 through 20. Finally, there are a few key themes that can be good to keep in mind as you read. The first is what most scholars call the messianic secret. So it seems that when Mark is writing his gospel, he often records that Jesus kind of conceals his identity as the Messiah, so he's not forthright about it, which is kind of captured by all of the gospel writers. But Mark kind of emphasizes this by his style of writing. So he kind of highlights this by pointing to the reaction of the people, like we talked about. He also is very open-ended with his questions. So he'll record that Jesus has done a miracle or something major has happened, and then he kind of just leaves this open-ended question: who is this man that can do things such as this? So there's kind of this secret aspect to it, but it's also this just kind of this building up, this way of Mark writing that kind of builds up to so that the audience is asking, who is it that's doing this, that's doing all these miracles and teaching with such authority? So there's that, and then there's also just the theme of gospel. So the term gospel today has quite a bit of a connotation with it. It's like a church Christianese word that you may, have specific things in mind of what this means. But as you read Mark's gospel, I want you to kind of put all of that out of your head and just think about how Mark is meaning it. In its simplest term, gospel just means good news. And so Mark is saying this is the good news of Jesus coming to earth and God doing something new through this person of Jesus. So it's not kind of the typical lingo of today where it's talking about, Jesus dying for your sins and, you becoming a believer. Instead, think of gospel just as the good news that Jesus has come to earth. And because he has come to earth, everything is different and things are happening. Finally, another major key theme is that Mark likes to show that Jesus is the servant king. So absolutely, he is the Messiah, the King of the Jews, the one that the Jews have been waiting for. But Mark also emphasizes how Jesus is a servant. And he wants to show that Jesus saves people not only in his throughout his ministry in his life, but also in his death. And so he shows that, of course, in Jesus's final moments there on the cross, that was all to pay the penalty for sins. But also Jesus was a servant all throughout his ministry as well, that he was pouring himself out for the sake of others. And a lot of what Jesus encountered, he encountered suffering. And so this would have been a major theme. This would have really resonated with that original audience. Remember, that audience is in Rome under the persecution of Nero and probably really struggling because Nero was a horrible man and he really hated Christians. And so by Mark emphasizing this, he's kind of hoping to encourage and comfort his original audience so that they have the courage to keep going. So, those are just some of the key themes, and that is just a flyby of some things that are helpful to know about Mark.